The sun was merciless that afternoon in Texas, burning every memory into the asphalt like a brand on raw skin. Rachel Monroe stood alone by the roadside, sweat sliding down her neck, her hands still smelling of engine oil and rusted bolts. She wasn't waiting for anyone. She had stopped waiting a long time ago. A silver Maserati glistened under the cruel sky, its hood open like a wounded beast. And there he was, Brandon Whitaker, the man whose name had been printed on headlines, the man whose smile had sealed billion-dollar deals, the man who had unknowingly left a child with a single promise that rotted for 20 years. He looked at her the way a king looks at a peasant, curious, slightly irritated, and utterly unaware of the war hiding behind her calm. When he saw the sapphire ring on her finger, his breath caught. But not because he remembered. Because deep down, some part of him felt the echo of a vow he had buried beneath silk ties and champagne toasts. Rachel tightened her grip on the wrench in her hand, her eyes sharp as a blade forged in betrayal. "Funny," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper carried by the wind. "You look like a man who has everything, but you lost the only thing that could have saved you." He didn't answer. He couldn't. At that moment, a gust of dry wind cut through the empty road, swirling dust around them like ghosts from a forgotten childhood. Rachel felt her chest tighten, a dull ache where a promise used to live. She glanced at the ring, its blue stone catching the sun one last time, like a lighthouse blinking before the storm. Some promises don't fade. Some come back to burn everything you thought was true. And this was just the beginning. The heat dripped off the Texas highway like honey left in the sun too long. Brandon Whitaker sat behind the wheel of his silver Maserati, his fingers tapping impatiently against the steering wheel, the leather hot enough to burn. The car had chosen the worst possible moment to betray him, right before the most important investor call of his career. He checked his watch. 11:43 a.m. Sweat pooled at his temples, rolling down his jaw. His crisp white shirt clung to his back, his tie now an unnecessary noose. When the engine coughed its last breath and a column of white smoke billowed from the hood, he slammed the door open and staggered into the brutal sunlight. The world outside roared with heat waves, the air so thick it felt like he was inhaling fire. He lifted the hood. Steam slapped his face like a punishment. For a moment, he stood frozen, the powerful CEO reduced to a helpless child on the side of an empty road. In the distance, the rattling sound of an old pickup truck broke the silence. A battered Ford, its paint faded and sides dented, rolled up slowly. It felt like an apparition. The door opened, and out stepped a woman with skin glowing under the sun, her hair tied in a tight bun, her shirt sleeves rolled high, her jeans stained dark at the knees. Rachel Monroe didn't ask for permission. She looked at the smoking Maserati as if it were a stray dog that needed scolding. "Car's broken?" she asked, her voice low and unbothered. Brandon's eyes narrowed. He took a small step back, unsettled by her directness. No one spoke to him that way, no one dared. "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" His voice came out sharp, almost defensive. Rachel didn't flinch. She pulled her gloves tighter, moved to the hood, and leaned over without hesitation. Her movements were precise, confident, a silent language of someone who had spent years listening to the heartbeat of machines. "Cooling systems dead. You've got 5 minutes before the engines toast," she said flatly. Brandon stood there, stunned, the words tumbling around in his mind like loose screws. He was used to admiration, obedience, applause, not this sharp, indifferent efficiency. Without waiting, Rachel walked to her truck, grabbed an old metal toolbox, and returned. She worked swiftly, hands darkened by grease but moving with the grace of a surgeon, her breathing steady, her focus unbroken. Brandon could only watch. For the first time, the man who controlled boardrooms and crushed competitors felt the ground shift beneath him. She finished, wiped her hands on a rag, and looked up. "It's patched for now. 2 hours if you're lucky." He reached into his wallet and pulled out several crisp bills. As he handed them to her, his eyes caught the flash of a ring on her finger, a thin silver band holding a sapphire stone. His fingers froze midair. The memory cut into him like a blade. A promise whispered under an oak tree, a ring slid onto a small hand, a promise he never kept, Rachel's eyes stayed locked on his. Her face unreadable, her posture unwavering. Brandon felt something collapse inside him. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. But the ring did. And in that moment, standing under the burning Texas sun, they were no longer mechanic and billionaire. They were two ghosts of a broken promise, staring at the wreckage of their shared past. Rachel turned, slid the bills into her pocket, and walked back to her truck without another word. Brandon stood there, the money still in his hand, the world suddenly too silent. A gust of wind stirred the dust around his feet, as if trying to whisper a name he had long forgotten. His car was fixed. But something else inside him had just begun to break. The smell of motor oil lingered like a shadow inside Monroe Auto Works long after Rachel closed the metal door behind her. She tossed her gloves onto the workbench, her fingers trembling as she reached for the old tin mug of cold coffee. The taste was bitter, but she swallowed it without flinching. The sapphire ring on her finger felt heavier tonight. She spun it slowly, the blue stone catching the dim light like a distant star refusing to die. She could still hear his voice, the arrogance, the disbelief, the hollow question that cut deeper than any blade. Upstairs, Naomi's soft breathing echoed through the thin walls. 13 years old, a girl who carried her mother's fierce spirit and her own gentle wonder. Rachel had always kept the past locked away, a box buried so deep it became part of her bones. But today, that box cracked open with a single glance. She walked to the small bedroom she had converted from an old storage room. Posters of vintage trucks covered the peeling walls. On the nightstand sat a faded photo of a girl with wide eyes standing under an oak tree beside a boy with hair like summer wheat. She sat on the edge of the bed and pulled an old wooden box from beneath. The lock clicked open like an exhale. Inside, yellowed papers lay folded, brittle at the edges, letters from her mother, Amelia, the woman they declared dead. The woman whose voice Rachel had carried like a hidden flame. One letter stood out, the ink smeared from tears long dried. "I didn't abandon you. They forced me to disappear." Rachel pressed the paper to her forehead, her breath shaky. She remembered the last day at the orphanage, how she had waited under the oak tree until the sun set and the cicadas began their lonely cries. She remembered the small hands that gave her the ring, the whisper, "I'll come back." She waited. She grew up. She learned to patch metal and mend engines. She learned to harden her heart so no promise could ever slice it open again. But today, a billionaire in a silk shirt showed up, wearing the face of that boy, carrying the same silence. Meanwhile, miles away in Houston, Brandon Whittaker sat in his high-rise apartment, the city lights glittering below like scattered diamonds. His whiskey glass trembled in his hand. He replayed the moment on the roadside over and over, her voice. The ring. The sudden collapse of certainty. He searched for her name online, stumbling through news articles, local garage reviews, scattered community bulletins, Monroe Auto Works, Rachel Monroe. He leaned back, the leather chair creaking under his weight. His father had taught him to bury weakness, to suffocate doubt before it bloomed. But tonight, something inside him refused to be buried. Rachel Monroe, the name hit him like a hammer. A distant memory flickered, the orphanage, the girl who carved wood with him in secret, the girl who called him son boy because his hair caught the light like dawn. Brandon pressed his palm against his forehead, his breath hitched. What had he left behind? In Aurora, Rachel folded the letter back into the box with careful hands. She closed it as though sealing a wound. She stood, her reflection flickering in the cracked mirror by the door. The woman staring back at her was no longer the little girl under the oak tree. But tonight, under the hush of cicadas and the low hum of streetlights, she felt that girl awaken, clawing her way back to the surface. Outside, a warm wind brushed past the old wooden sign of Monroe Auto Works, rattling it softly, like a whisper in the dark. Rachel placed the box back under her bed, her fingers tracing the edge as if to reassure herself it was still real. She walked to Naomi's room, stood at the door, and watched her daughter sleep. The girl shifted, mumbling in her dreams. Rachel smiled faintly. Not tonight. Tonight, the ghosts would remain hers alone. But tomorrow, the truth would start breathing again. Night swallowed Aurora in a thick, heavy hush. The stars above flickered like old wounds refusing to close. Inside Monroe Auto Works, the smell of grease and metal clung to the walls, lingering like a second skin. Rachel sat alone at her workbench, the only light coming from a single overhead bulb that hummed softly, almost like a lullaby for the broken. She held the sapphire ring between her fingers, turning it slowly. Its surface seemed to glow under the harsh light, a tiny universe trapped in silver. Her thoughts spiraled backward. She saw the oak tree again. She heard cicadas droning like a choir of secrets. She felt the warmth of a small hand slipping a ring onto hers. "I'll come back. I promise." The memory pressed against her ribs, sharp enough to draw breath but not blood. She looked over at the wooden box, its edges frayed, its lock fragile from years of trembling hands. She had guarded it like a dying flame, each letter a brick in the fortress she built around her heart. A creak at the doorway pulled her back. Uncle Luther stood there, his massive silhouette framed by the hallway. His eyes, weathered and soft, scanned the scene before him. "Digging up ghosts again," he said, his voice rough as old sandpaper. Rachel didn't turn, her fingers curled tighter around the ring. "Some ghosts never stayed buried," she replied. Luther stepped forward, his boots echoing against the concrete. He pulled up a chair, the wood groaning under his weight, and sat beside her. "You know," he started slowly, "machines, they only break where they've been strained the most. People, they're not so different." Rachel's breath shivered. Her eyes drifted to her toolbox, to the worn rag still stained with engine coolant. "I thought I'd moved past it," she said. "I thought building this shop, raising Naomi, fixing what I could touch, it would be enough." Luther leaned back, studying her face, as if trying to read a manual written in a lost language. "Enough for surviving, maybe," he murmured, "but never enough for healing." Rachel looked up sharply, her eyes gleaming with something between fury and surrender. "He showed up today," she whispered. "Brandon Whitaker, the boy from the orphanage. The one who promised he'd come back." Luther's eyes darkened. His jaw tightened, the old scars in his hands flexing as he clenched his fists. "He didn't recognize me," Rachel continued, her voice cracking. "Not even a flicker, just a stare, like I was another engine to be assessed." Silence dropped over them like a heavy tarp. "Maybe he forgot," Luther offered, though his voice betrayed his doubt. Rachel shook her head. "Or maybe he chose to forget," she said, "because it's easier to live in the mansion of lies than in the shack of broken promises." Luther exhaled slowly, as though each breath had to be negotiated with old ghosts. "You planning to confront him?" he asked finally. Rachel stood, her shadow long and fractured across the floor. She wiped her hands on the rag, then threw it into a bucket. "Not yet," she said, "but the truth. It's stirring, and once it starts moving, it doesn't stop." Meanwhile, in Houston, Brandon sat in his glass-walled office, the cityscape a silent witness to his unraveling mind. On his desk, an old bird-shaped wooden brooch rested, the edges worn smooth by years of small hands. He picked it up, his thumb tracing the initials R and B carved with a shaky hand. The memory thundered in. The girls' laughter under the oak tree, the scent of wet earth after rain, the rhythm of their secret afternoons carving shapes they thought would last forever. Brandon's chest heaved. His fingers trembled. All the curated articles, the speeches, the tailored suits, they felt like costumes on a borrowed stage. He stood abruptly, the chair toppling behind him, his breathing ragged. "Rachel Monroe," he whispered into the dark, the words tasting like rust and regret in Aurora. Rachel leaned against the garage door, her head tilted up to the night sky. "Naomi deserves the truth," she murmured to herself, "even if it burns everything down." Inside, Luther watched her from the doorway, his eyes heavy with both dread and pride. Outside, the oak tree by the workshop rattled softly in the warm breeze, as if trying to remember the names carved into its old bark. Tonight, the ghosts were no longer content to sleep. They were ready to rise. Houston at midnight pulsed like a fever. Brandon stood alone in his study, the floor-to-ceiling windows casting his reflection back at him like a ghost he didn't recognize. The city below glittered, but each light felt like a needle in his veins. His hand hovered over the old bird-shaped brooch on his desk. The initials R and B glowed faintly under the lamp. A memory, half buried, clawed its way up. the girl's small hands guiding his, the whisper of a blade against wood, the warmth of a promise he had carried like a seed that never sprouted. He slammed his fist onto the table, papers scattered like startled birds. He grabbed his phone, dialing a number he had memorized long ago but never dared to use. The voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm. "Carter Whittaker's office, how may I help you?" "I need to speak to him," Brandon's voice shook. Now, moments later, Carter's deep voice sliced through. "Brandon, what is it at this hour?" Brandon swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust. "Aurora, the land, Rachel Monroe, tell me everything." A cold silence. Then Carter laughed, a sound that made Brandon's skin crawl. Digging up graves, son. Let them stay buried." Brandon's hand curled around the edge of the table, knuckles white. "Did you force Amelia Monroe to disappear? Did you fake her death to seize that land?" Carter sighed, as though bored. "You think power is built on kindness. That land is worth more than gold. Water rights alone are a lifetime's fortune." Brandon felt something snap inside. "I deserve the truth," he growled. "You deserve nothing but what I gave you," Carter replied, voice icy. "Stay focused. The future is not built on ghosts." Brandon ended the call abruptly. His chest heaved. He moved to the wall of bookshelves and began tearing at the spines. Hidden behind the rows of polished hardcovers, his fingers found a small brass latch. A safe. His breath caught. He turned the key, the one he had secretly copied years ago, the day Carter drunkenly celebrated his Harvard acceptance. The lock clicked open. Inside lay folders, each stamped with dates and codes. His fingers trembled as he flipped through. Crimson, Equinox, Selene, then Aurora. He pulled it out. The first page was a map, the Monroe land outlined in red, the word "seize" scrawled in Carter's handwriting across the top. Next, a legal transfer form. "Due to lack of heirs, this land is transferred to Whittaker Holdings under Emergency Regional Development Clause." The final page stopped his heart. A death certificate. Amelia Monroe, cause of death. Car accident. No remains recovered. Signed, Carter Whittaker. A handwritten note pinned to the back. "Ensure no loose ends. The girl is irrelevant once land is secured." Brandon staggered back, dropping the folder. His knees hit the floor. He pressed his hands to his face, as if he could rub away the lies that had molded his life. Somewhere inside him, a boy screamed. The boy who carved birds and whispered promises. He crawled forward, fingers trembling, and clutched the wooden brooch to his chest. Meanwhile, in Aurora, Rachel sat at her workbench, Naomi's laughter echoing faintly in her memory. The old wooden box lay open beside her, letters stacked like fragile bones. She picked up the brooch Brandon had mailed to her that morning, her thumb tracing the faded lines. Her eyes filled, but no tears fell in her mind. She saw him again. The boy with hair like sunlight, trying to carve a shape into a broken world. She whispered to the dark, "Why did you leave me to drown alone?" At that moment, Luther entered quietly, holding 2 cups of steaming tea. "He's not the boy you remember," Luther said softly, setting the cups down. "But maybe he wants to be." Rachel didn't answer. She pressed the brooch against her palm until her skin turned white. Outside, the oak tree's branches shivered under a sudden wind, as if echoing her silent cry. In Houston, Brandon rose from the floor. His eyes burned with a clarity he had never known. He gathered the documents, the brooch tucked safely in his pocket. Tonight, the empire built on ashes had started to crack. And so had the boy who once promised to return. Dawn crawled over Aurora, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and gray. Rachel stood outside Monroe Auto Works, her breath clouding in the early chill. The shop felt different this morning, as if the walls had started listening to her heartbeat again. Inside, Naomi still slept, her arm curled around a stuffed rabbit, a small fortress of innocence Rachel had fought so hard to protect. A pickup engine growled outside. Rachel turned slowly. Brandon stepped out. No suit, no watch, just a plain shirt, his hair disheveled, eyes hollow from a sleepless night. He held a folder to his chest like a shield. Rachel didn't move. She stood rooted, her fingers brushing the edge of her wrench belt. Brandon walked forward, each step hesitant, the ground beneath him feeling like thin ice. When he finally stopped in front of her, he tried to speak, but his lips trembled. I know, Rachel said first, her voice flat as a blade laid on cold steel. You found the files. Brandon nodded, his breath shallow. He opened the folder and handed it to her. Inside, she saw her mother's death certificate, the forged signature, the property transfer, the handwritten note from Carter. Rachel flipped through the pages slowly, each word a nail driven into the coffin of her old life. All this time, she whispered. He wrote me off like a line item on a balance sheet. Brandon swallowed hard. He did the same to me, he said, his voice cracking. Everything I am, it's built on this theft, on your mother's suffering, on your silence. Rachel looked up sharply, her eyes searing into him. You think showing up here changes what you abandoned? Brandon took a step back, his face pale. I didn't know, he stammered. I swear to you, Rachel, I didn't know. Didn't know? Rachel scoffed. You wore your father's name like a crown while I was learning to clean blood from my knees after running away from a foster home. You didn't know while you signed deals over champagne and forgot the girl under the oak tree. Brandon's lips parted, but no words came. He looked at the ring on her finger, the sapphire now a burning ember in the morning light. That ring, he whispered, his voice a ghost. I gave it to you, didn't I? Rachel stepped closer, her face inches from his. You did, she said. You put it on my hand and said you'd come back, and I waited every day, every goddamn day. I waited for a boy who never even looked back. Brandon's shoulders slumped. His hand drifted to his pocket where the wooden bird brooch sat, heavy as a confession. I was taken away, he tried again. They cut me off from everything. The orphanage, you, my own past. Rachel's fingers curled into fists. Convenient, she spat. A clean slate for the prince. Meanwhile, they scattered us like stray bolts on a workshop floor. The wind picked up, swirling dust around their feet. Brandon pulled out the brooch and held it up. I kept this, he said, his voice trembling. I didn't know why until now. Rachel looked at it, her face unreadable. Proof of nothing, she whispered. A toy for a child who played at promises. Brandon fell to his knees, the papers spilled onto the ground, fluttering like wounded birds. Please, he choked. I want to fix this. Help me make it right. Rachel stood over him, her eyes wet but cold. Fix, she echoed. This isn't an engine you can swap parts for. This is blood, memory, land, a mother's name. Brandon raised his eyes to hers, hollow and desperate. What do you want me to do? Rachel leaned down, her face close enough that he could feel the heat of her breath. I want you to remember who you really are, she said, her words sharp as soldered metal. I want you to remember the girl under the oak tree, the girl you left, the land you stood on, the mother you helped bury without even knowing her name. She pulled back, standing tall as a storm brewing on the horizon. And when you finally remember, she continued, her voice a low thunder, then you can choose whether you're his son or a man who stands for something real. Brandon looked at the dirt, his breath shaking like a machine on its last sputter. Rachel turned and began gathering the scattered documents, her movements precise and deliberate. As she tucked the last page into her hands, she paused, her back to him. And don't come back, she said, her voice breaking like old metal. Not until you're ready to face the ghosts you helped create. She walked back toward the garage, the sunrise catching the edge of her ring, casting blue sparks across the gravel. Brandon remained on his knees, the brooch in his hand, the wind lifting his hair like a mourning shroud. Behind him, the sun crept higher, revealing every crack, every flaw, every secret carved into the dirt of Aurora. For the first time in his life, Brandon didn't know which direction to crawl toward, and Rachel didn't look back. Night swallowed the Whittaker mansion in thick, velvet silence. Brandon stood at the front gate, the iron bars cold against his palms. For a moment, he considered turning back, disappearing into the shadows. But the truth clawed at his spine, urging him forward. He pushed the gate open and stepped onto the marble path. Each step felt like walking on glass, every echo a reminder of the lies that paved this empire. Inside, the grand foyer loomed above him. Crystal chandeliers, polished floors, walls lined with portraits of powerful men who built fortunes on other people's graves. At the end of the hall, Carter Whittaker sat in his favorite armchair, a glass of brandy in hand. He didn't look up as Brandon approached, his gaze locked on the flames dancing in the fireplace. You look like a man who's seen a ghost, Carter drawled, swirling the amber liquid. Brandon stopped a few feet away, his breathing shallow. "I know about Aurora," he said. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled. Carter's eyes flicked up, cool and sharp. "And?" Brandon stepped forward, tossing the folder onto the table. Pages spilled out. Maps, forged certificates, Amelia Monroe's death record. Carter glanced at them, unimpressed. "I see you've been busy," he said, setting his glass down. Brandon's jaw tightened. "You lied to me, you lied to everyone, you destroyed them for land, for water, for power." Carter leaned back, crossing his legs. "I built this family to last beyond me, beyond you, beyond your petty morality." Brandon's voice rose. "You took her mother, you stole her life. You left a girl to rot in foster homes while I lived like a prince in a cage." Carter chuckled, a dry, joyless sound. "You think your life was real? You think I didn't shape every breath you took, every friend, every deal, even that girl, a loose end I had to erase." Brandon staggered back as if struck. "What are you talking about?" Carter stood, his shadow stretching across the room like a dark wound. "You were never my son," he said, his words cutting deeper than any blade. Brandon froze, his mind stuttering. "What?" Carter stepped closer, his eyes glinting with triumph. "You were adopted from Open Heart Orphanage. You were chosen, molded, a replacement after my real son died. You were never meant to inherit my blood, only my name." Brandon's knees buckled, and he fell against the table, his fingers gripping the edge as if it might save him from drowning. "You used me," he gasped. "I crafted you," Carter corrected, his voice almost tender. "You were my masterpiece, my proof that legacy is not about blood but control." Brandon felt his throat close. The room tilted, every memory crashing down like shards of broken glass. The oak tree, the ring, Rachel, his voice cracked. "Rachel, she's my sister." Carter's lips curled into a thin smile. "A poetic twist, isn't it, you two, bonded by a lie, both fighting ghosts you can't kill?" Brandon turned away, his body shaking violently. The weight of decades pressed into his chest, every breath a battle. "You destroyed her life," he whispered. "You destroyed mine." Carter moved behind him, his footsteps soft, almost fatherly. "I made you strong," he said, resting a heavy hand on Brandon's shoulder. "Sentiment makes men weak. You're free of that now." Brandon spun around, his fist connecting with Carter's face. The older man stumbled back, clutching his cheek, eyes wide with shock. Brandon loomed over him, his voice ragged. "I am not your son, and I will not carry your sins." Carter's expression hardened, rage flashing beneath his skin. "You think the world will care? You think they'll choose you over me? You are nothing without this name." Brandon stepped back, his eyes burning. "Rather be nothing than live as your ghost." He turned, storming down the hallway. His pulse thundered in his ears, his feet barely touching the ground. As he passed the main hall, he glanced at the portraits one last time. Men with cold eyes and stiff collars, guardians of a kingdom built on silence. At the door, he paused. For the first time, he felt light, empty but free. Outside, the night air cut into his lungs like a promise of rebirth. Brandon looked up at the stars, his breath misting in the dark. Rachel, Naomi, Amelia, his real family. He clenched his fists, his voice a vow to the quiet night. "Coming back, I will remember. I will make this right." And without another glance behind, he disappeared into the darkness, a man reborn from ash and lies. Aurora's morning light crept over Monroe Auto Works, painting everything in soft gold, as if the world dared to believe in new beginnings. Rachel stood at the sink, scrubbing oil from her hands, each movement slow, deliberate. The water turned black before swirling down the drain. Naomi sat at the table, her homework spread out, humming quietly to herself. The innocence in her voice made Rachel's chest ache. Outside, Luther stacked old tires by the fence, his breath steady, his mind miles away in memories he never shared aloud. Rachel dried her hands and turned to the window. In the distance, she saw a car pulling up. A quiet sedan, unremarkable except for the figure stepping out. Brandon. He stood still for a moment, holding a folder tight against his chest, his eyes scanning the yard like a man searching for land to plant his final seed. Rachel's shoulders tensed. She moved to the doorway, blocking the view of Naomi. Brandon walked slowly up the path, his steps hesitant but unwavering. When he stopped a few feet from her, neither of them spoke at first. The silence felt like standing on the edge of a high rooftop. One wrong word and they both would fall. Brandon finally lifted his eyes, the sun catching the edges of his tears. "I know who I am now," he said, his voice raw. Not Carter's son, not the heir to an empire built on graves. Rachel's eyes flickered to the folder. Brandon followed her gaze and slowly opened it, revealing documents, photographs, handwritten notes. "Proof," he said, holding it out. "Of everything, the land theft, the forged death certificate. My real adoption file, your mother's letters." Rachel's fingers hovered over the papers, but she didn't take them. Instead, she looked straight into his eyes. "Why come back?" she asked, her voice low. "Why not stay hidden and let it all rot in the dark?" Brandon swallowed hard. His hands shook as he clutched the folder tighter. "Because I finally remembered," he whispered. "The girl under the oak tree, the promise, the ring, you." Rachel's breath caught. Brandon stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You don't have to forgive me," he said. "I don't deserve it, but I will stand beside you, I will expose him, and I will help you reclaim what was stolen." A breeze stirred between them, carrying the smell of old engines and wildflowers blooming beyond the fence. Luther stepped out from behind the workshop, wiping his hands on a rag. He watched them quietly, his eyes heavy with caution, but glinting with a spark of something like hope. Rachel finally reached out and took the folder. Her fingers brushed his, and for a moment they stood frozen in that small contact. She pulled the papers to her chest, her face unreadable. Brandon stepped back, his shoulders sagging, as if surrendering all he had left. Naomi peered from inside, curiosity lighting her face. Rachel glanced at her, then looked back at Brandon. "She deserves to know the truth one day," Rachel said softly, her voice trembling. "But not today." Brandon nodded, wiping at his cheeks with the back of his hand. "I'll wait," he said, "as long as it takes." Luther stepped forward then, his voice low but firm. "I'm not walking into this alone anymore," he said, his hand resting on Rachel's shoulder. "It's time we finish what they started." Rachel's eyes flickered, her lips parting as if she might object. But then she looked down at the folder in her arms and her jaw tightened. "Then we move tonight," she said, her voice now a blade. "At the groundbreaking ceremony, in front of everyone." Brandon looked up, startled but resolute. "Ready?" he asked. Rachel turned to face him fully, her eyes sharp and shining. "I've been ready since the day he put this ring on my finger," she said, lifting her hand, the sapphire glinting like a promise reborn. Brandon lowered his head, a single tear slipping down, catching the morning light like a shard of glass. And for the first time, as they stood together in the dusty yard of Monroe Auto Works, they didn't feel like broken pieces. They felt like the start of something whole. Twilight descended over Aurora, bleeding violet and gold across the sky like an old bruise healing. At the edge of town, floodlights lit up the newly paved lot of the Aurora Rising complex. The stage towered above a sea of chairs draped in white cloth, each seat waiting for the powerful and the curious. Banners hung proudly. "A new future, a new legacy." Carter Whittaker stood backstage, adjusting his cufflinks, his reflection sharp in the mirror. His eyes glimmered with practiced confidence, each wrinkle a trophy of deals made in dark rooms. Outside, reporters tested microphones, camera crews checked cables, and guests in tailored suits sipped champagne as they waited. Rachel pulled the truck into a side service gate, her hands steady on the wheel. Brandon sat beside her, a storm brewing behind his eyes. In the backseat, Luther held the folder tight, as though guarding the last living heartbeat of a dying truth. Rachel killed the engine. The silence felt like a held breath. She looked at Brandon. "Once we step out, there's no turning back," she said. Brandon nodded, his jaw tight. "I know," he whispered. "Ready?" Luther leaned forward, his voice low and sure. "You too remember," he said, his eyes flicking between them. "They built this empire on fear. Tonight, you tear it down with truth." Rachel looked at the sapphire ring on her hand one last time, the stone catching a flicker of dying sunlight. They stepped out into the evening air, their feet heavy but unstoppable. As they approached the side of the stage, security guards glanced over, but with their forged access badges and reflective vests, no one stopped them. Carter's voice boomed through the speakers as he began his speech. My family has always believed in rebirth, he declared, his smile wide and hollow. A chance to turn forgotten lands into dreams for future generations. Rachel stood at the stairs, her chest heaving. Brandon touched her arm lightly. We do this together, he said. Rachel nodded, her eyes shimmering. On stage, Carter lifted a golden shovel, ready to signal the start of the groundbreaking. In that instant, Rachel stepped forward, her boots echoing across the platform. Brandon followed close behind, his steps a promise, not an apology. Gasps rippled through the audience. Flashbulbs burst like small lightning strikes. Carter turned, his face draining of color. Rachel Monroe, he spat, voice low and dangerous. Get off this stage now. Rachel didn't flinch. She raised the folder high, the papers trembling only slightly. This is the truth you buried, she shouted, her voice ringing across the lot. The land you stole, the mother you erased. The children you scattered like dust. Reporters pushed forward, cameras zooming in, catching every tremor in Carter's forced smile. Brandon stepped beside her, lifting a second set of documents, his voice breaking but clear. I am not your son, he roared. I am Brandon Monroe, and I refuse to carry your name, your crimes, your empire of lies. Carter lunged forward, but Luther appeared at the base of the steps, his broad frame blocking the path. Not tonight, Luther growled, his voice deep and final. Carter froze, eyes darting between the three of them. Rachel tore open the folder, scattering the papers into the wind. Pages rained down over the crowd like a twisted confetti of confessions, deeds, forged signatures, letters from Amelia. Gasps turned to shouts. A sea of camera flashes turned the night into a stuttering strobe. Rachel lifted her hand, the ring glinting under the stage lights. My mother is alive, she cried. She was never your casualty. And today she will walk back into the light you tried so hard to snuff out. The side gate burst open. Amelia Monroe stepped forward, escorted by a young volunteer, her hair silver, her back slightly bent, but her eyes sharp as a blade honed in the dark. The audience went silent, as if the world itself forgot how to breathe. Rachel ran to her, falling into her arms. Amelia held her daughter tight, burying her face into Rachel's hair, trembling with decades of stolen time. Brandon approached, his eyes glistening, and Amelia reached out, her hand resting gently on his cheek. You are mine too, she whispered, her voice a thread of iron. Lost, but never gone. Carter stepped back, his mouth opening and closing, no sound coming out. Sirens wailed in the distance, a rising chorus growing louder as squad cars and federal agents pulled up. Brandon turned to the crowd, his voice firm. This is your legacy, Carter Whittaker, he shouted. A legacy of theft, silence, and betrayal. And it ends tonight. Amelia raised her head, her voice cracking but defiant. I am Amelia Monroe, she declared. I am not dead, I am not lost. I am the mother you tried to bury. Rachel, Amelia, and Brandon stood together, the final fracture of an empire echoing beneath their feet. The stage lights flickered, the banners fluttered in the cold wind. And for the first time, Aurora witnessed not the rise of a new empire, but the rebirth of a family too stubborn to die. 2 days after the storm on the stage, headlines across the country screamed in bold letters. Whittaker Empire falls. Truth buried for decades finally unearthed. Monroe family reclaims Aurora. Rachel sat in the small kitchen of Monroe Auto Works, a steaming mug of black coffee in her hands. The walls felt different now, less like a cage, more like a heart finally beating in its own rhythm. Outside, Naomi chased a stray puppy around the yard, her laughter slicing through the morning air like sunlight on cold metal. Amelia stood at the porch, her eyes following Naomi's every move, her smile cautious but alive. Inside, Brandon sat at the table across from Rachel. His hair was uncombed, sleeves rolled up, a stack of legal documents spread in front of him. They had spent the entire night reading, signing, and tearing down what remained of Carter's empire. Rachel looked at him, her fingers tapping lightly on her mug. You didn't have to stay, she said softly. Brandon looked up, exhaustion in his eyes, but something else too, a quiet flame. I did, he said, because this is my family now, not the towers, not the empire, you, Naomi, Amelia, Luther, the land. Rachel's eyes softened. She set her mug down and leaned back, her shoulders dropping as if she had finally set down a load she'd carried her entire life. Brandon pushed a document toward her. "The final paperwork," he said. "The land title officially transferred to Monroe Foundation. No more loopholes, no more hidden signatures. It's yours again." Rachel took the paper, her fingers trembling. Her eyes scanned the lines, each word stitching a wound inside her. She exhaled sharply, the sound half a sob, half a battle cry finally released. "Thank you," she whispered. Outside, Naomi darted up to the window, her face pressed against the glass. "Mom," she called out, "the puppy wants to stay." Rachel turned, her lips pulling into a real, unguarded smile. "Then let him," she said, her voice carrying warmth Naomi had never heard before. Amelia stepped inside, wiping her hands on her skirt. She looked at Brandon, then at Rachel, her eyes shining. "Your father would be proud," Amelia said quietly, her hand resting on Rachel's shoulder. Rachel looked at her mother, her heart swelling. "No," she replied. "He would be shocked, but I think he'd understand." Luther entered then, carrying a toolbox, his face breaking into a tired grin. "The community center is almost ready," he said, "and the new apprentices, they'll be here tomorrow." Brandon stood, folding the last document. "The Monroe Institute for Youth Futures," he said. "A place to teach what really matters, hands that fix, hearts that don't forget." Rachel nodded, tears pooling but not falling. Brandon stepped closer, his hand hovering at her elbow. "Not asking for forgiveness," he said, his voice low. "Asking for a chance to build something real, with you." With them, Rachel looked at him, her eyes sharp but no longer cold. "Then start by helping me fix that old truck outside," she said, her lips twitching into a small smile. Brandon laughed, a sound foreign but deeply right in the space. "Deal," he replied. Amelia watched them, her hand resting on the table, her fingers tracing invisible lines of old grief now transformed into new paths. Outside, Naomi ran in circles with the puppy, her hair catching the morning light like a banner of freedom. Inside, the smell of coffee and oil, old paper and new breath, mixed into something that felt like home. Rachel looked out the window, the sapphire ring on her finger gleaming as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to finally glow. A moment where nothing had to be hidden, a moment where silence had finally lost. And for the first time in years, Monroe Auto Works wasn't just a shop, it was a beginning. 6 months later, Aurora stood under a soft spring sun, the air thick with the scent of wildflowers and fresh paint. Where the Aurora Rising complex once loomed in blueprints, a new sign now stood tall. Amelia's Haven Community Park and Vocational Center. Children ran across the open fields, chasing kites that drew bright streaks across the sky. A new garden bloomed nearby, rows of vegetables and sunflowers swaying in the breeze. Rachel stood at the entrance, her hands on her hips, wearing a denim jacket and grease-streaked jeans. The sapphire ring glinted on her finger, catching the morning light like a small flame. Beside her, Amelia leaned against a wooden railing, her face weathered but bright, eyes alive with a quiet, unstoppable strength. Luther walked across the courtyard, a clipboard in one hand, a group of teenagers following him eagerly, hanging on to every word about engine parts and welding techniques. At the far end, Naomi knelt in the soil, planting seeds with a small group of younger kids. Her laughter bubbled up, weaving itself into the breeze, light and unstoppable. Brandon stepped out from the main building, sleeves rolled up, dirt on his palms, a wide grin splitting his face. "Rachel." He called out, holding up a small carved wooden bird, the initials R and B still barely visible. "I think I finally got the wings right." Rachel turned, her eyes softening as she watched him. "Getting there," she teased. "A few more tries, and maybe I'll let you hang it in the workshop." Brandon laughed, his face open in a way it had never been under Carter's shadow. Amelia stepped forward, reaching for Rachel's hand. "Your father would have loved this," she said softly, her voice trembling but proud. "A place where things and people are fixed, not thrown away." Rachel squeezed her mother's hand, her eyes shimmering. "He's here," she whispered, tapping her heart. "In every bolt we tighten, every promise we keep." Brandon joined them, his breath steady, his gaze turning to the crowd of families gathered near the garden beds. "We've had 20 new apprentices enroll this month," he said. Kids who had nowhere to go, now they have a place to learn to belong. Rachel nodded, her gaze drifting to Naomi, who waved at her with muddy fingers. That's what this was always about, she said. Not revenge, not even justice, but giving them what we never had a chance to build to heal. A soft breeze passed, lifting strands of Rachel's hair, carrying the scent of soil and new growth. Brandon turned to her, his voice low. "Thank you for not giving up on me," he said, "for letting me earn my place here." Rachel looked at him, a small smile playing on her lips. "You're family," she said. "We don't give up on each other, ever." Amelia stepped closer, wrapping her arms around both of them. Luther joined, laying a calloused hand on Brandon's shoulder. For a moment, they stood in a quiet circle, the heartbeat of a family rebuilt from ashes and silence. Beyond them, the park hummed with life. Laughter, shouts, the clink of tools, the rustle of leaves. Naomi ran up then, breathless, her eyes wide. "Mom, Uncle Brandon, Grandma. They need help moving the new compost bins." Rachel tousled her hair, grinning. "Then let's go," she said. They moved together, side by side, stepping into the wide yard that once held nothing but ghosts and broken promises. Under the blue Texas sky, Amelia's haven stood not as a monument to pain, but as a living, breathing promise. A promise that no one would be forgotten again. A promise that every broken thing and every broken heart could find its way home.